On a morning in the autumn of 859, a man stood at the prow of a longship as it entered waters no Viking had ever sailed. Behind him, stretched across the glittering surface of a sea that would later be called the Alboran, 61 other ships followed in a formation that had taken 3 months and 2,000 miles to assemble. The sun was wrong. It hung too high, burned too bright, cast shadows that fell at angles unfamiliar to men raised under northern skies. The air tasted of salt and something else, something dry and ancient, carried on winds that had crossed deserts these Scandinavians could not yet imagine. The man at the prow wore no helmet. His hair, lighter than the men around him, caught that foreign light and threw it back. He was perhaps 30 years old. He had been raiding since he could lift an axe. He had seen the monasteries of Ireland burn, had watched the great rivers of Francia run red with the blood of its defenders, had helped hold Paris itself for ransom. None of that had prepared him for this. The water beneath his keel was impossibly blue. Not the gray-green chop of the North Sea, not the black depths of the Atlantic, but a blue so vivid it seemed almost artificial, as if some god had poured dye into the basin and forgotten to stir. Fish swam in schools so dense they darkened patches of that blue to purple. The coastline to his left, he would learn to call it starboard when speaking of these southern waters, rose in cliffs of yellow and red stone, dotted with vegetation that stayed green even in autumn, even when the trees of his homeland had already begun their long surrender to winter. His name was Björn. The sagas would call him Björn Ironside, though the reason for that epithet remains disputed across 1,000 years of scholarship. Some say it was literal, that he once survived a blow that should have killed him, that his ribs turned a blade meant for his heart. Others say it was metaphorical, a testament to his endurance, his refusal to break under pressure that shattered lesser men. Still others suggest it was ironic, a nickname given in mockery that he wore until it became sincere. The sources do not agree. The sources rarely do. What they agree on is this: in the years 859 to 861, Björn Ironside led the largest and most ambitious Viking expedition ever to enter the Mediterranean Sea. 62 ships, perhaps 3,000 men. A fleet that would raid 4 modern nations, sack cities that had stood since before Rome fell, and penetrate deeper into the classical world than any Scandinavian force before or after. He would burn mosques in North Africa and churches in Italy. He would enslave the populations of islands that had not seen such violence since the Vandals. He would, most famously, mistake an obscure Italian port for the Eternal City itself, and sack it anyway, turning his error into a legend that would echo through the saga literature for centuries. And then, he would go home. He would navigate his fleet back through the Strait of Gibraltar, past the Frankish and Iberian coastlines his men had ravaged on the way down, through the Bay of Biscay and into the English Channel and around the long finger of Jutland, and finally, back to the halls of Scandinavia. He would arrive with slaves and gold and stories that would become myths. He would live another 30 years. He would die, as far as we know, in his bed, one of the few great Viking leaders of his generation to manage that particular feat. This is the story of that expedition. It is a story of navigation and violence, of miscalculation and adaptation, of a culture at the height of its expansionary power, encountering a world it had only heard rumors of. It is also a story of sources, of what we know, what we think we know, and the vast, dark spaces where knowledge fails and speculation begins. The waters of the Mediterranean had been sailed by Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Carthaginians. They had been crossed by armies and merchant fleets, by emperors and refugees, by the most sophisticated civilizations the Western world had produced. In 800 BRI, they were about to be crossed by men from a land most Mediterranean peoples could not have located on a map. Men who worshipped gods the classical world had never heard of. Men who built ships unlike anything that had ever floated on these waters. The collision was about to begin. Before we can understand what Björn Ironside did in the Mediterranean, we must understand what we can and cannot know about it. The sources for this expedition are frustratingly fragmentary, often contradictory, and written down decades or centuries after the events they describe. The nearest thing we have to a contemporary account comes from Frankish annals, the Annals of Saint-Bertin, the Annals of Fulda, and scattered references in other chronicles maintained by monasteries throughout the Carolingian world. These sources are valuable because they were written close to the time of the events. They are also limited because they were written by monks who viewed the Vikings as instruments of divine punishment, demonic figures sent to chastise Christendom for its sins. The monks recorded what happened, but they rarely recorded why, and they had no interest in understanding the invaders as anything other than a plague. The Iberian sources are thinner. The Chronicle of Alfonso III mentions raids on the Spanish coast. Arabic sources, particularly the writings of al-Yaqubi and fragments preserved in later compilations, describe attacks on North Africa and the Balearic Islands. But these sources are often vague on specifics, and they do not always agree on dates, locations, or the identity of the raiders. The Italian sources are better, at least for certain episodes. The sack of Luna, the city Björn allegedly mistook for Rome, appears in multiple chronicles, and the story of how he took it became famous enough that it was retold and embellished across centuries of European literature. The saga sources, the Icelandic texts that provide most of our narrative detail about Björn's life, were written down in the 13th century, 300 years after the events they describe. They are invaluable for their vividness and their preservation of oral tradition. They are also deeply problematic as historical sources. The sagas mix history with legend freely, and distinguishing between the two requires careful cross-referencing with the earlier, drier analytic sources. What can we establish with reasonable confidence? That a major Viking expedition entered the Mediterranean around 859. That it was led by figures the sources call Björn and Hastein, or Hasting, depending on the chronicle. That it raided extensively along the coasts of Iberia, North Africa, southern France, and Italy. That it sacked a city called Luna in Tuscany. That it returned to Scandinavia around 861 or 802, significantly reduced in size from losses to combat, disease, and other causes. Everything else, the precise route, the specific battles, the internal dynamics of the expedition, the motivations of its leaders, must be reconstructed from fragments and inference. This is the nature of Viking history. We are working with shards of pottery, trying to imagine the shape of the whole vase. The reconstruction is worth attempting, because what those shards suggest is one of the most audacious military expeditions of the early medieval period, a journey that pushed Viking capabilities to their absolute limit and demonstrated both the terrifying mobility of Scandinavian raiders and the profound fragility of the post-Roman Mediterranean world. To understand why Björn Ironside's fleet entered the Mediterranean in 859, we must first understand the world that produced him. The Scandinavia of the 9th century was not a nation. It was not even a collection of nations in any sense that would be recognizable today. It was a landscape, a vast peninsula and associated islands stretching from the Arctic Circle to the temperate zone, cut by fjords and studded with mountains, blessed with endless coastline, and cursed with agricultural land that could only marginally support its population. The people who lived there spoke related dialects of a language we now call Old Norse. They worshipped a pantheon of gods whose names, Odin, Thor, Freya, would echo down the centuries. They organized themselves into local chieftaincies and petty kingdoms whose borders shifted with every generation, held together less by formal institutions than by webs of kinship, oath, and mutual obligation. They were also, by the standards of their time, extraordinary shipbuilders and sailors. The vessels they constructed, long, shallow-drafted, clinker-built boats with overlapping planks, riveted together and sealed with animal hair and tar, represented the pinnacle of early medieval naval technology. These ships could cross open ocean, navigate shallow rivers, and be portaged overland when necessary. They were fast, seaworthy, and beautiful in a functional way that still arrests attention 1,000 years later when we see their remains in museums. The Vikings, a word that meant something like raiders from the bays, had been expanding outward from Scandinavia for generations by the time Björn was born. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 is traditionally taken as the beginning of the Viking Age, but it was merely the first raid that Christian chroniclers recorded in detail. Scandinavian expansion had been building pressure for decades before that, driven by a combination of factors that historians still debate: population growth, primogeniture, customs that left younger sons without inheritance, improvements in ship technology, the weakness of neighboring kingdoms, the wealth of undefended monasteries, or some alchemical mixture of all these causes. By the 840s, the Vikings had established permanent presences in Ireland and the Scottish Islands. They had begun settling in what would become the Danelaw, the eastern half of England. They had penetrated deep into Francia along its rivers, raiding Paris in 845 and extracting the first of many ransoms from the Carolingian kings. They had explored Iceland and were beginning to settle it. They had traveled east along the Russian rivers, establishing trade routes that connected Scandinavia to Constantinople and the Islamic world. And they were beginning to probe southward along the Atlantic coast of Iberia into waters that led toward an enclosed sea about which they knew almost nothing except that it existed and that it contained wealth. The Mediterranean was, for 9th century Scandinavians, something like what the Pacific was for 19th century Europeans. A vast, semi-legendary space that maps could not adequately describe, filled with civilizations whose antiquity and complexity dwarfed anything in the raiders' experience. The Byzantine Empire still held sway in the east, ruling from Constantinople with an unbroken chain of authority stretching back to Rome itself. The Islamic caliphates controlled North Africa and most of Iberia, their cities glittering with wealth accumulated from trade routes that spanned 3 continents. Italy was a patchwork of Lombard duchies, papal territories, and Byzantine remnants, fought over by local powers and occasionally by Carolingian kings who claimed inheritance of the Roman imperial title. These were not the monasteries of Ireland. These were not the squabbling petty kingdoms of England. These were the successors of Rome, the guardians of civilization, the centers of a world that had been building cities while Scandinavians were still living in longhouses. Björn Ironside was about to test whether any of that mattered against 62 longships and 3,000 men who had nothing to lose. Bro, the Ragnarsons, the sons of Ragnar, were the closest thing the Viking Age produced to a royal dynasty, though the word royal fits poorly on structures so fluid. Ragnar Lothbrok himself may or may not have existed as a single historical figure. The name appears in multiple sources across multiple decades, attached to exploits that seem to require 2 or 3 simultaneous lives to accomplish. Modern historians generally believe that Ragnar Lothbrok was either a composite figure, several different raiders merged into one legendary form, or a single man whose historical deeds became encrusted with the accomplishments of others. What is more certain is that a cluster of men claiming to be his sons operated throughout the mid-9th century as some of the most successful and famous Vikings of their generation. Ivar the Boneless, whose invasion of England and role in creating the Danelaw has been extensively documented. Halfdan, who ruled parts of England and died fighting in Ireland. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, named for a distinctive mark in his iris. Ubba, who was killed at the Battle of Sinwit. And Björn, called Ironside, whose fame would rest not on England but on waters far to the south. The brothers cooperated when it suited them and competed when it didn't. They formed alliances, split armies, rejoined, and separated again in patterns that the sources rarely allow us to trace in detail. They were united, when they were united at all, by the inheritance of their father's reputation and the network of warriors and oathmen who had followed him. Björn's early raids are poorly documented. The sagas place him in Francia and England during the 840s and 850s, participating in the great campaigns that brought Viking armies to the heart of the Carolingian and Anglo-Saxon worlds. He would have been present at some of the formative experiences of his generation, the sieges, the negotiations, the moments when Christian kings discovered that paying tribute only brought the raiders back for more. What set Björn apart from his brothers, eventually, was ambition that pointed in a different direction. Ivar wanted England. Halfdan wanted land to rule. Björn wanted to see how far he could go. The decision to enter the Mediterranean was not impulsive. It required years of preparation, careful accumulation of intelligence, and the assembly of a force large enough to operate independently for an extended period in waters where resupply would be difficult and reinforcement impossible. Björn spent the years before 859 building that force, recruiting crews, acquiring ships, gathering information from traders and earlier raiders who had probed the Spanish coast. His partner in this endeavor was a man the sources call Hastein, sometimes Hasting, sometimes rendered in other forms depending on the chronicle. Hastein was older than Björn, more experienced, and by some accounts the more cunning of the two. He had led raids in Francia, extracted ransoms from Carolingian nobles, and developed a reputation for ruthless pragmatism that complemented Björn's physical courage. The sources disagree about whether Hastein was Björn's mentor, his equal partner, or his subordinate. They agree that the two men commanded the expedition jointly. 62 ships. The number appears in multiple sources with enough consistency that we can treat it as approximately accurate. Each ship carried perhaps 40 to 50 men, warriors, oarsmen, and the essential specialists who kept a medieval fleet operational. Navigators who could read the sun and stars, craftsmen who could repair damaged hulls, men who understood the magic of sail and oar that turned wooden planks into vehicles of conquest. 3,000 men, give or take. It was not the largest army the Vikings had ever assembled. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 was larger, but it was the largest to attempt something so geographically ambitious. These men were about to travel roughly 4,000 miles, round trip through waters none of them had ever sailed, raiding civilizations none of them fully understood, navigating by dead reckoning and coastal observation through straits and passages that even experienced Mediterranean sailors found challenging. In the spring of 859, the fleet departed from the mouth of the Loire. They had spent the previous years raiding up and down that river, extracting tribute from the cities along its banks, and the Loire Delta served as a natural staging point for expeditions into the Atlantic. The ships would have been provisioned with dried fish, smoked meat, barrels of fresh water, and the hard bread that Vikings carried on long voyages. They would have been armed with swords, axes, spears, shields, and the composite bows that some Scandinavians had adopted from Eastern contacts. They sailed south. The Atlantic coast of Iberia was not entirely unknown to Vikings by 859. Earlier expeditions had raided along its length, probing the defenses of the Asturian kingdom in the north and the Umayyad Emirate in the south. But those had been hit-and-run affairs, quick strikes followed by rapid withdrawal. Björn's expedition was different in scale and intention. He was not there to raid a monastery and vanish. He was there to find a way through. The Iberian Peninsula, in the 9th century, was divided by one of the great fault lines of medieval history. The Christian kingdoms of the north, Asturias, Navarre, and their associated territories, clung to the mountains and coastline, remnants of Visigothic Spain that had survived the Islamic conquest of 711. They were poor, martial, and fiercely defensive of their remaining territory. Below them, stretching across the south and center of the peninsula, lay Al-Andalus, the Islamic territory ruled from Córdoba by emirs who claimed authority as successors to the Umayyad Caliphate. The Umayyad Emirate of Córdoba was one of the most sophisticated polities in 9th century Europe. Its capital was a city of perhaps 500,000 people, larger than any city in Christian Europe, larger than anything the Vikings had ever seen. Its libraries held texts that would not be available in Latin for centuries. Its agriculture, based on irrigation techniques inherited from the Romans and refined by Islamic engineers, supported population densities that Scandinavians could barely imagine. Its armies were experienced, professional, and equipped with the best weapons and tactics the Islamic world could provide. Björn's fleet sailed past this civilization like a blade along the edge of a wound. The sources record that the expedition raided along the Iberian coast, but the details are frustratingly vague. We know they hit targets in what is now Portugal and southwestern Spain. We know they lost some ships. The Franks record that they were opposed by Andalusian naval forces and suffered casualties. We know they did not attempt to penetrate inland, to strike at Córdoba or Seville, despite the wealth those cities contained. This restraint is revealing. Björn was not interested in taking on the Emirates' full military strength. He was interested in passing through and reaching the destination he had set for himself. The Iberian raids were opportunistic, taking what could be taken quickly, avoiding engagements that might cripple his fleet, but they were not the point. The point was the strait. The Strait of Gibraltar is roughly 8 miles wide at its narrowest point, a bottleneck between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea, between the Iberian Peninsula and the North African coast, between the world the Vikings knew and the world they were about to enter. The currents are treacherous, driven by the exchange of water masses between two bodies with different temperatures and salinity levels. The winds can shift rapidly. Ships have been wrecked in those waters for as long as ships have sailed them. The strait had been fortified since antiquity. The name itself derives from the Arabic Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, named for the Berber general who had led the Islamic conquest of Iberia in 711. By 859, both sides of the passage were under Islamic control. The Umayyad Emirate held the northern shore. The Idrisid dynasty and associated Berber powers held the south. Any fleet passing through would be observed from both sides, and the narrow waters made concealment impossible. Björn's fleet passed through anyway. We do not know exactly how he managed it. The sources offer no tactical detail of the transit. What we can infer is that he moved fast, that he moved in force, and that neither Islamic power was able to assemble sufficient naval strength quickly enough to stop him. The Umayyads were dealing with internal problems, succession disputes, and regional rebellions that distracted their attention from coastal defense. The North African powers were fragmented, their navies oriented toward the Mediterranean interior rather than the Atlantic approaches. 62 ships entered the Mediterranean Sea in the summer of 859. They were the first Scandinavian vessels to do so in recorded history. The men aboard them were about to discover a world that would challenge everything they thought they knew about raiding, about navigation, and about the limits of Viking power. The water turned blue beneath their keels. The air turned dry and hot. The coastlines that opened before them were studded with cities older than any settlement in Scandinavia, older than the oldest temples of their gods, older than memory itself. The Mediterranean campaign had begun. The first target was the coast of North Africa. This decision reveals something important about Björn's strategic thinking. He had just spent months raiding his way down the Atlantic coast of Iberia. He had lost ships and men to Andalusian resistance. The logical next step, from a risk management perspective, would have been to head north and east into the relatively safer waters of Christian southern France, territory that had been raided by Vikings before and whose defenses were known to be weak. Instead, Björn turned south. The Moroccan coast in 859 was nominally under the control of the Idrisid dynasty, though central authority had fragmented significantly since the dynasty's founding in 788. Various local rulers, Berber tribal leaders, and autonomous governors controlled different stretches of the coastline. The great cities, Fez, Marrakesh, lay inland, protected by distance and terrain. But the coast itself was dotted with smaller settlements, fishing villages, and trading posts that served the commerce between Al-Andalus and the African interior. The Vikings landed somewhere in the region of Nekor, a small emirate in the Rif Mountains of what is now northern Morocco. The details are preserved primarily in Arabic sources, and they paint a picture of devastating speed and violence. The raiders struck without warning, pillaging what they could carry, burning what they couldn't, and, crucially, capturing slaves. Slavery was central to the Viking economy in ways that modern audiences often find uncomfortable to discuss. The Scandinavians were not unique in this. The Mediterranean world was built on slave labor, and the Islamic empires maintained sophisticated slave trading networks that spanned 3 continents. But the Vikings were enthusiastic participants in the system, and captives taken in raids could be worth more than gold or silver on the right markets. The captives from Nekor included dark-skinned North Africans, people whose appearance was so unusual to the Scandinavians that the Irish annals, recording the fleet's eventual return, would make special note of them. They were called blue men in the sources, a term whose exact meaning has been debated, but which clearly indicates something visually striking to observers accustomed to Northern European coloration. These captives would travel thousands of miles before their journey ended. Some would be sold in the markets of Dublin or York. Some would remain as slaves in Scandinavian households. A few, according to later sources, would eventually return to Africa through the complex trade networks that connected the Viking world to the Mediterranean. Their individual fates are lost to history, but their presence in the expedition's records reminds us that this was not abstract history. It was an operation that left fingerprints on thousands of human lives, most of whom left no testimony of their own. From Morocco, the fleet turned east. The Balearic Islands rose from the Mediterranean like a scattered promise of easier targets. Majorca, Minorca, Ibiza. These islands had been prizes of Mediterranean commerce for millennia, changing hands between Carthaginians, Romans, Vandals, Byzantines, and now various Islamic powers. By 859, they were under the nominal authority of the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba, but garrisoned lightly and governed with the loose attention that distant rulers often pay to offshore possessions. The Vikings descended on them like a summer storm. The sources record that Björn's fleet raided all three major islands, though the details of individual landings are mostly lost. What we can reconstruct suggests a pattern: approach by sea, land in force, overwhelm local resistance before it could organize, strip the settlement of valuables and captives, and withdraw before reinforcement could arrive. The islands' populations were small, their defenses oriented toward piracy rather than large-scale invasion. They had never seen anything like 62 longships appearing on their horizon. The speed of the Viking operational tempo was, by Mediterranean standards, almost inconceivable. Scandinavian raiders could cover vast distances in days that would have taken weeks for contemporary armies. They required no supply lines, no siege equipment, no elaborate logistics. They carried their supplies in their ships, they moved when the wind allowed, and they struck wherever weakness presented itself. This mobility was their greatest weapon, greater than any sword or axe. But it was also their greatest vulnerability. They were always far from home, always operating on accumulated supplies, always one bad storm or one successful ambush away from disaster. The very speed that made them dangerous also stretched them thin across an enormous operational theater. Björn understood this. His movements suggest a man constantly calculating. How much can we take before we have to move? How long can we stay before resistance organizes? How far can we push before our luck runs out? From the Balearics, the fleet turned north, toward the coast of Provence. The southern coast of Francia in 859 was recovering from decades of Viking predation. The great river systems, the Loire, the Seine, the Garonne, had served as highways for Scandinavian raiders since the 830s, and the inland cities had learned to pay tribute, build walls, and pray. But the Mediterranean coast had been relatively sheltered. The distance from Scandinavian bases, the difficulty of the Atlantic Passage, and the presence of Islamic naval power in the western Mediterranean had all served to protect it. That protection ended when Björn's fleet sailed into the Gulf of Lion. The Rhone Delta was their entry point, the river that drained half of eastern France and reached the sea through a complex network of channels and marshlands. The cities along its lower reaches, Arles, Nîmes, towns whose names had been famous since Roman times, had not seen Scandinavian raiders before. Their walls were old, in some cases ancient, but they had been built against different enemies in different eras. The fleet landed, and the pattern repeated. Swift strikes, overwhelming force, rapid extraction. The sources record that the Vikings established a base somewhere in the Camargue, the marshy delta region where the Rhone splits into multiple channels before reaching the sea. From this base, they could raid upriver, retreat to their ships, and sortie in multiple directions as opportunities presented themselves. They burned, they plundered, they captured. And then, as the summer of 859 gave way to autumn and the first year of the expedition drew toward its close, Björn made the decision that would define his legacy more than any other single act of his long and violent life. He decided to raid Italy. Specifically, he decided to raid Rome. The decision to strike at Rome was not, in the context of 9th century Scandinavian ambition, as implausible as it might first appear. Rome in 859 was no longer the Rome of the Caesars, no longer the administrative heart of a Mediterranean-spanning empire. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed 4 centuries earlier, and the city that had once commanded the world had spent those intervening centuries shrinking, decaying, being sacked repeatedly, and transforming into something its ancient inhabitants would scarcely have recognized. But it remained Rome. The name still carried weight that no other city in the Christian world could match. It was the seat of the papacy, the spiritual center of Latin Christendom, the repository of relics and treasures accumulated over 8 centuries of Christian devotion layered atop the wealth of pagan antiquity. To sack Rome would be to strike at the symbolic heart of the religion that had been spreading northward into Scandinavia, the faith that Charlemagne had imposed on the Saxons at sword point, the creed that threatened to dissolve the old gods into irrelevance. There was strategic calculation in the ambition, but there was also something else, a hunger for the legendary, a desire to achieve what would echo through the centuries. Björn Ironside, if he could take Rome, would become more than a successful raider. He would become the man who humiliated Christendom in its own holiest city. The problem was finding it. This detail tends to get lost in the romance of the story, but it bears emphasis. Björn and his fleet had no reliable maps, no nautical charts in the modern sense, no clear geographical knowledge of the Italian peninsula, beyond what they might have gathered from captured merchants or coastal pilots. They were navigating by dead reckoning, by the accounts of others, by the shape of coastlines and the direction of currents. They knew Rome existed. They knew it was somewhere on the western coast of the Italian peninsula, some distance south of the Frankish territories. They knew it was wealthy beyond imagining and holy beyond measure. But the specifics, the exact location, the approach by sea, the relationship between the coast and the city, were obscure. The Italian coast they encountered as they rounded the southern edge of Francia and entered the Tyrrhenian Sea was a landscape of ancient cities, many of them still bearing the walls and harbors that Roman engineers had built centuries before. These cities had names that had been famous when Scandinavia was still an unknown wilderness at the edge of the world, names from the histories that monks still copied in candlelit scriptoria across Europe. To Scandinavian raiders approaching from the sea, one walled Italian city might have looked much like another. Luni was such a city. Situated near the border of modern Tuscany and Liguria, Luni had been an important Roman settlement. Luna, they had called it, a port city that had grown wealthy on the marble trade from the nearby quarries of Carrara. The same white marble that Michelangelo would carve 7 centuries later had made Luni rich in antiquity. The city had walls. The city had churches. The city had the appearance, from the sea, of significant wealth and importance. It sat at the mouth of the Magra River, positioned where trade routes from the interior met the maritime lanes of the Tyrrhenian coast. What happened next has become one of the most famous episodes in the entire history of the Viking Age, though separating the historical core from later embellishment is essentially impossible. The story as it has come down to us, preserved in sources written long after the events and shaped by the narrative needs of saga tradition, runs something like this. Björn's fleet approached Luni. The city's defenders, alarmed by the sight of so many ships, closed their gates and manned their walls. The Vikings, assessing the situation, recognized that a direct assault would be costly. The walls were strong, the defenders alert, and the fleet's numbers, though formidable, were not infinite. Every man lost in an Italian assault was a man who could not be replaced until they returned home. So Björn attempted a stratagem. A message was sent to the city's bishop, for Luni, like other Italian cities of this period, was governed in part by its ecclesiastical authorities. The message announced that the Viking leader was dying. He had been wounded, or perhaps he was simply ill. The sources vary. In his final hours, he wished to convert to Christianity and receive baptism before death. Would the bishop come out to perform the sacred rite? The bishop, moved by the prospect of saving a barbarian soul at the moment of death, agreed. Björn was carried to the city gates on a litter, apparently at the point of death. He was baptized, the sacrament was performed, and then, in the most dramatic versions of the story, he died. The Christian rites required burial in consecrated ground, and so the gates were opened to admit the funeral procession. A coffin was carried into the city, surrounded by mourning warriors. And once inside the walls, at the moment of maximum vulnerability for the defenders, Björn sprang from the coffin, very much alive, and the mourners threw off their cloaks to reveal weapons, and the gates were seized before they could be closed, and the fleet's warriors poured into the city, and Luni fell. It is a magnificent story. It is also, almost certainly, at least partially false. The narrative has all the hallmarks of later saga elaboration, the clever stratagem, the theatrical resurrection, the inverted Christian symbolism of a false baptism and a false burial leading to very real massacre. Similar stories appear elsewhere in Viking legend. The trick entry via feigned death is a motif that recurs with suspicious frequency. That does not mean nothing happened at Luni, or that no stratagem was employed. It means we cannot trust the specific details as historical fact. What we can say with more confidence is this: Björn's fleet attacked Luni. The city was sacked. It was not Rome. At some point, whether before the assault, during it, or after, the Vikings realized their error. The great prize they had crossed the Mediterranean to claim remained beyond their reach. The sources say Björn was furious when he learned the truth. Rome was still far to the south, perhaps 200 miles down a coast that was now fully alert to the presence of a Scandinavian fleet. The advantage of surprise was gone. The Italian cities between Luni and Rome would have heard of the northern raiders by now, would be closing their gates, lighting their signal fires, sending desperate messages to whatever military forces might be in a position to intercept. The dream of sacking the Eternal City evaporated in the Italian summer heat. Whether Björn actually believed Luni was Rome, or whether the later sources imposed this error onto the narrative for dramatic effect, remains unknowable. It is not implausible that warriors operating on fragmentary geographical knowledge could have made such a mistake. It is also possible that the Luni attack was always intended as a target of opportunity, and the Rome confusion was a later narrative device to explain why the fleet turned back without striking the ultimate prize. The sources we have cannot resolve the question. They can only give us the shape of what happened: attack, sack, disappointment, retreat. But the sack of Luni, mistaken identity or not, was devastating for the city. Luni never truly recovered. The combination of Viking violence and the slow silting of its harbor over subsequent centuries reduced it from a significant regional center to an abandoned ruin. Today, the archaeological site of ancient Luna is a quiet place of fragmentary walls and excavated foundations, its marble long since carted away for use elsewhere. The Vikings' passage through it was brief, a matter of days, perhaps weeks at most, but the wound they inflicted was mortal over the long term. From Luni, the fleet turned away from the dream of Rome, but the expedition was far from over. The autumn of 859 found Björn's fleet moving south along the Italian coast, raiding as they went but no longer driving toward any single great objective. The Tyrrhenian Sea opened before them, its waters warmer than anything they had known in the North Atlantic, its coasts dotted with targets that ranged from small fishing villages to fortified towns. Pisa, which would become one of the great maritime republics of medieval Italy, was among the cities that felt the Vikings' attention during this phase of the expedition, though whether it was sacked, merely raided, or simply threatened is unclear from the fragmentary sources. The operational logic of this phase was different from the concentrated strikes of the expedition's early months. Having failed to reach Rome, having already accumulated significant plunder, Björn seems to have shifted to a more opportunistic pattern, moving along the coast, taking what presented itself, avoiding the heaviest resistance, building toward the eventual return journey. The fleet had been away from Scandinavia for months. Winter was approaching, and the Mediterranean winter, while mild by Norse standards, still complicated maritime operations. The seasonal storms that swept through the Tyrrhenian and the uncertain anchorages of an unfamiliar coast made continuous raiding difficult. The sources suggest that Björn established a winter base somewhere along the Italian coast, possibly on one of the smaller islands, possibly in a sheltered bay on the mainland. The details are vague because the contemporary sources had no observers embedded with the fleet, and the later saga traditions were more interested in the dramatic set pieces than in the logistics of overwintering. But winter they must have, somewhere, for the fleet to have survived to continue operations the following year. Consider what this meant for the men of the expedition. They had left their homes in Scandinavia more than a year ago by now. They had sailed the length of the Atlantic coast, fought their way past the Islamic defenses of Spain, threaded the Strait of Gibraltar, raided the coasts of 3 continents, taken a city that some of them might genuinely have believed was Rome. They were living on accumulated plunder and whatever they could take from the landscape around them. They were far beyond any possibility of reinforcement or rescue. If disaster struck, disease, shipwreck, a concentrated military response, there was no one coming to save them. The winter months were a pause, a breath, a regrouping. Ships would have needed repair. The long Mediterranean summer had been hard on hulls and rigging, and even the superbly designed Scandinavian vessels required maintenance after months of continuous operation. The wounded needed time to heal or to die. The plunder needed to be secured, organized, perhaps redistributed among the ships to ensure no single loss would be catastrophic. And the men needed rest. Not merely physical rest, but the psychological respite of something approaching routine after months of constant motion and violence. We cannot know what Björn was thinking during those winter months. The sources give us nothing of his interior life, nothing of the calculations and worries and hopes that must have occupied a commander responsible for several thousand men in hostile territory thousands of miles from home. But we can infer the outline of his situation. He had achieved extraordinary things. He had also fallen short of the greatest prize. He had accumulated wealth, but he had also lost men and ships. He was deep in a sea that none of his ancestors had ever sailed, surrounded by civilizations far older and more sophisticated than his own. And spring would bring the necessity of decision. What to do next? When spring of 860 arrived and the expedition resumed its movements, Björn faced a choice that speaks to the fundamental nature of the Viking enterprise. He could attempt to return home the way he had come, back through the Strait of Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast, hoping that the same combination of skill and luck that had brought him south would carry him safely north. Or he could press further into the Mediterranean, exploiting the opportunity that presented itself to raid territories that had never seen Scandinavian ships before. He chose to press on. The fleet moved south from its Italian winter quarters, rounding the toe of the Italian peninsula and entering the waters that separated Italy from North Africa. This was ancient maritime territory, the sea lanes that had connected Rome to its Egyptian breadbasket, that had carried Carthaginian traders and Roman legions and Byzantine merchants for over a millennium. The North African coast appeared on the southern horizon, another continent, another civilization, another opportunity. The North Africa of 860 was fragmented. The great Arab conquests that had swept across the region 2 centuries earlier had established Islam as the dominant religion and Arabic as the language of power, but political unity had long since fractured. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad claimed nominal authority over North Africa, but actual power resided with various local dynasties and governors who paid lip service to distant caliphs while pursuing their own agendas. The Aghlabid Emirate, based in what is now Tunisia, controlled much of the central North African coast. To the west, the territories that would become Morocco were under other authorities. To the east, Egypt was its own complex political environment. Björn's fleet struck at the North African coast, where exactly the sources do not make clear. The regions around modern Tunisia or Algeria seem most likely based on geography and the fleet's probable route. What the local populations made of these pale-skinned raiders from the north, arriving in ships unlike anything they had seen before, we can only imagine. The coastal communities of North Africa had dealt with Mediterranean pirates for centuries. Piracy was endemic to these waters and would remain so for another 1,000 years. But Vikings were something new. The raids were brief. The sources give us almost nothing about specific targets or the scale of plunder taken. What we can infer is that Björn found the North African coast less rewarding than he had hoped. The Islamic territories were not undefended. They had their own naval traditions, their own coastal fortifications, their own experience with maritime threats. And the logistical realities were challenging. The further south the fleet went, the further it was from any possibility of return, the more stretched its supplies became. The fleet turned north again, recrossing the waters between Africa and Europe. The central Mediterranean in spring, Sicily to the east, Sardinia to the west, the Italian and North African coasts defining the basin's edges, was a confined space by Viking standards. The enormous distances that Scandinavian raiders were accustomed to covering did not exist here. Everything was closer, more interconnected, more surveilled by the various powers whose interests converged in these ancient waters. Sicily presented itself as they moved north. The great island, positioned at the crossroads of every Mediterranean trade route, had been fought over continuously since the Phoenicians first established trading posts. There, nearly 2,000 years before Björn's arrival. In 860, it was in the midst of a slow Islamic conquest that had begun in 827 and would not be complete until 902. The northern part of the island was still under Byzantine control. The southern part had fallen to the Aghlabids. The result was a divided, contested territory where neither major power had complete authority and where local populations lived under the constant pressure of ongoing warfare. The sources are frustratingly vague about whether Björn raided Sicily directly or merely passed through its surrounding waters. Later accounts suggest some engagement with the island, but the details are contradictory, and the contemporary evidence is nearly non-existent. What seems certain is that the fleet passed through the region, that some interaction with the local powers occurred, whether violent or otherwise, and that the Vikings did not linger. Sicily's divided state made it less attractive than it might seem. There was no single authority to overwhelm, no clear center to strike. The fragmented political landscape that might have seemed like an opportunity was actually a complication. From the waters around Sicily, the fleet continued its northward arc, moving back toward the Italian coast and the eventual passage west toward Gibraltar and home. But the expedition was not yet finished with violence, and violence was not yet finished with it. The return journey, which occupied the latter part of 860 and extended into 861, proved far more costly than the outward passage. The element of surprise was gone. The various powers of the Mediterranean, Spanish, North African, Italian, were now fully aware of the Scandinavian presence and had had months to prepare. The Strait of Gibraltar, in particular, had become a killing ground. The Umayyad forces that had failed to prevent Björn's entry into the Mediterranean were determined not to let him leave. The narrow passage between Spain and Africa was ideal for interception. The fleet would have to pass through a confined space with land on either side, committed to a course that could not easily be altered. The Islamic naval forces of Al-Andalus, whatever their limitations had been in the summer of 859, had been reinforced and repositioned. They were waiting. The battle at the strait, or more likely a series of engagements as the fleet attempted to force its way through, was costly. The sources are inconsistent about the exact toll, but all agree that it was severe. Some accounts suggest that Björn lost as many as 40 of his 62 ships, though this figure is probably exaggerated. What seems certain is that a significant portion of the fleet was destroyed in the passage, whether by direct combat, by fire ships, by the navigational hazards of the strait compounded by hostile action, or by some combination of all these factors. The survivors broke through into the Atlantic. They had entered the Mediterranean with 62 ships, perhaps 3,000 men. They left with far fewer. The exact numbers are lost, but the expedition that had seemed invincible in the spring of 809 limped home in the summer of 861, diminished and bloodied. The plunder they brought back was still enormous. Prisoners, gold, silver, silk, artifacts from a dozen different cultures and 3 continents. By any conventional measure, the expedition was a success. They had gone further than any Norse fleet before them. They had raided targets that would have seemed impossibly distant to earlier generations. They had returned with wealth that would make its participants rich and famous. The material rewards were real, but the human cost was also real. Of the men who had sailed south with Björn in 859, perhaps half did not return. The expedition had been a gamble on a civilizational scale, and the gamble had paid off. But the price had been measured in Scandinavian blood spilled from the Guadalquivir to the Tiber, from the coasts of Africa to the walls of Luni. Björn Ironside came home to find that the world he had left had continued without him. His brothers had been busy in his absence, pursuing their own ambitions, acquiring their own territories, building their own legends. The great invasion of England that would define the legacy of Ragnar's sons was still in the future. 865 would bring the great heathen army to English shores, and the story of that conquest would ultimately overshadow the Mediterranean expedition in the popular memory of the Viking Age. But for now, in 861, Björn was the most famous of them, the man who had sailed beyond the edge of the known world and returned with its treasures. The ships were beached, the plunder was divided, the dead were mourned or forgotten, depending on how much they mattered to those who remembered them. And somewhere, in a Scandinavian hall, as the fire crackled and the mead flowed and the survivors told their stories to audiences who would never see the blue waters of the Mediterranean or the white walls of Italian cities, the legend began to take shape. The man who had sacked Rome, even though he hadn't, became a figure larger than life, a byword for audacity and reach, for the willingness to go further than anyone believed possible. The saga would say he eventually became king of Sweden, though the historical evidence for this is thin. It would say he lived to old age and died in his bed, though we cannot verify this either. What we can say is that he passed out of the historical record and into the legendary one, his life's details blurring into the mythic as generations of storytellers shaped his memory to suit their needs. The Mediterranean expedition remained his greatest achievement, the voyage that defined what a Viking could accomplish, the demonstration that no target was too distant, no civilization too ancient, no sea too unknown. The question that remains, the question that every historian of the Viking Age must eventually confront, is what the expedition actually meant. Not what it meant to the skalds who shaped it into legend, not what it meant to later generations who saw in it proof of Norse superiority or audacity or civilization-threatening barbarism, but what it meant at the time to the men who sailed and the worlds they touched. The answer is not simple, and the sources do not make it easier. For the Mediterranean civilizations that experienced the raids, the Norse incursion of 859-861 was traumatic, but not transformative. The Islamic Emirates of Al-Andalus had faced worse, had faced in fact the Norse before, in 844, and would face them again. The destruction at Algeciras and Nakr was severe, but not unprecedented in a world accustomed to coastal raiding, to the ebb and flow of maritime violence that had characterized Mediterranean life since antiquity. The Balearics recovered, the Italian city-states rebuilt. Even Luni, whatever damage it sustained, continued to exist as a settlement, though its decline into eventual abandonment owed more to malaria and silting harbors than to Norse destruction. The Mediterranean had absorbed the shock of the Viking incursion as it had absorbed so many shocks before, the Vandals, the Arabs, the various convulsions of the post-Roman centuries. It would absorb this one too. But the absorption was not without consequence. The defenses that the Norse encountered on their return through the Strait of Gibraltar, the coordinated response that cost them so many ships, represented a learning process. The Islamic world had adapted to the Norse threat, had developed countermeasures, had demonstrated that even the most audacious raiders could be made to pay for their audacity. This lesson would matter in the decades to come, as Norse activity in the Western Mediterranean diminished and eventually ceased entirely. The Vikings would remain a factor in the Atlantic world, in the North Sea, in the Baltic, in the river systems of Russia. But the Mediterranean would largely slip from their grasp, not because they lacked the capability to return, but because the calculus of risk and reward had shifted against them. The defenses were too strong, the distances too great, the easier targets too abundant elsewhere. For the Scandinavian world, the expedition's meaning was different. Björn and Hastein had demonstrated that the sea routes were open, that the wealth of the south was accessible to those bold enough to reach for it. They had mapped, in their bodies and their ships, a geography of possibility that extended far beyond anything their ancestors had known. The Mediterranean, that storied sea, that center of ancient civilization, that crossroads of empires, was not beyond reach. The walls of Italian cities could be breached, the treasures of African coastlines could be seized, The world was larger than anyone had suspected, and it was not defended by gods or monsters, only by men, and men could be overcome. This was the expedition's legacy to Norse consciousness, the expansion of the imaginable. After Björn, nothing seemed impossible. After 861, when the ships returned laden with Mediterranean plunder and Mediterranean stories, the horizon of Viking ambition stretched to encompass the entire known world. The great heathen army that would descend on England in 865 was led by men who had grown up hearing what Björn had accomplished. The settlements in Iceland and Greenland, and briefly in North America, were founded by people whose mental maps had been shaped by the knowledge that their ancestors had once sailed to Rome, or what they believed was Rome, and returned alive. The factual error at Luni matters less in this context than the psychological truth it encoded. Björn had attacked the symbolic center of Western civilization. That he had attacked the wrong city was a detail. The ambition was the point. The willingness to reach that far, to strike that target, to imagine oneself capable of challenging the heart of an ancient world. This was what the expedition taught, and this was what the saga tradition preserved. But there is another meaning, one that the sources do not emphasize because the sources were written by those who survived, the meaning that inheres in the men who did not return. 3,000 men perhaps had sailed south in the spring of 859. Perhaps 1,500 came back. The numbers are uncertain, but the scale of loss is not. Hundreds of Scandinavians, young men mostly in the prime of their lives, died in waters they had never seen, on coastlines they could not have found on any map, fighting enemies whose languages they did not speak. They died of wounds taken in battle, of diseases contracted in unfamiliar climates, of drowning when their ships broke up in storms or under the fire of Moorish defenders. They died in the Guadalquivir and the Rhone, in the harbors of the Balearics and the approaches to Italian cities, in the Strait of Gibraltar where the expedition met its bloodiest reckoning. Their names are not recorded. The sagas do not mourn them. They exist only as an absence, a subtraction, a deficit in the mathematics of return. 62 ships went out, perhaps 20 came back. The difference is measured in corpses that no one recovered, in families who waited for sons and husbands who would never arrive, in farms that lost the labor they needed to survive, in children who grew up without fathers and were told only that he had gone south to the warm sea to seek fortune and had not come home. This is the cost that the legends do not count. The expedition was glorious, the plunder was vast, the distances were mythic, but somewhere in every hall where the story was told, there were people who had lost someone, who heard the tales of Mediterranean adventure with grief rather than wonder, who knew that the gold and silk had been purchased with the blood of men they loved. The Mediterranean expedition was not only an achievement, it was also a tragedy, a mass death event disguised as an adventure story, and the silence of the sources about that tragedy is itself a kind of historical violence, a forgetting that began before the expedition was even over. Björn came home rich, Hastein came home famous, the dead stayed where they had fallen, in waters that did not remember them, in lands that burned them or buried them or left them where they lay. This is what it meant to be a Viking, to gamble one's life on the chance of wealth and glory, knowing that the odds were not as favorable as the survivors' stories would later suggest. The men who returned told tales of their own courage and cunning, of storms weathered and battles won, and treasure seized from the hands of enemies. The men who did not return told nothing at all. Their silence is the shadow that falls across every saga, every heroic narrative, every account of Viking achievement. For every Björn Ironside who came home to become a legend, there were dozens who came home diminished, and hundreds who did not come home at all. The Mediterranean expedition of 859-861 should be understood, then, as both of these things simultaneously, a genuine achievement of exploration and military capability, and a catastrophe that cost Scandinavia a generation of young men for the benefit of a few survivors' wealth and fame. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. The greatness and the horror exist in the same ships, the same waters, the same moment of historical time. This is what it means to study the Viking Age honestly, to hold the adventure and the atrocity in the same hand, to refuse the choice between celebration and condemnation, to see the whole picture even when the sources want to show you only part of it. The wealth that Björn brought back did not stay concentrated for long. The economy of plunder was an economy of distribution. The men who had risked their lives expected compensation, and the compensation came in the form of shares. The treasure was divided according to formulas that are not entirely clear to us, but that seem to have been understood by all participants. So much for the leader, so much for the ship captains, so much for the ordinary warriors, so much for the families of the dead. The gold and silver and silk and captives flowed outward from the returning ships into the broader Scandinavian economy, where they were exchanged and gifted and inherited and stolen and lost. Some of this wealth can be traced archaeologically. Arabic dirhams from the period have been found in Scandinavian graves and hoards, their origins impossible to determine with certainty, but consistent with the Mediterranean expedition's roots. Byzantine and Frankish artifacts appear in contexts that suggest they were acquired during the raids. Silk fragments in graves indicate trade connections or plunder connections with regions far to the south. The material record confirms what the written sources suggest, that the expedition brought genuine wealth back to Scandinavia, that this wealth circulated, that it shaped local economies and social hierarchies in ways both large and small. But material wealth was not the only thing the survivors brought home. They brought knowledge, geographic knowledge of routes and coastlines and currents, military knowledge of foreign defenses and tactics, cultural knowledge of how other peoples lived and worshipped and organized their societies. They brought stories, which became currency of a different kind, traded in halls and marketplaces, accumulated and embellished with each retelling. They brought reputations, which in the honor economy of Norse society were worth more than silver. And they brought trauma. This is the element the sources do not discuss, but it must have been present. Men who had spent 2 years in constant danger, who had watched friends die in foreign waters, who had done things to survive that violated whatever moral constraints they might once have observed. These men did not simply return to normal life. The psychological toll of the expedition is invisible in the historical record, but cannot have been absent. The violence experienced and inflicted, the fear, the grief, the disorientation of long separation from everything familiar, all of this would have come home with the survivors, shaping their behavior and their relationships in ways we cannot measure, but should not ignore. The Mediterranean expedition was, among other things, a mass trauma event. The men who experienced it were marked by it, and the marks were not all scars that could be displayed proudly in drinking halls. Some of the marks were internal, carried silently, expressed in ways that the sources do not record because the sources do not care about the interior lives of warriors. The Viking Age is full of such silences, moments when we know that human beings must have felt things, must have struggled with things, must have been shaped by things, but the evidence we need to understand those experiences simply does not exist. We are left to infer, to imagine, to project backward from our understanding of how human beings respond to extreme circumstances. This is dangerous ground for historians, and we should tread carefully. But it would be more dangerous to pretend that the psychological dimensions of Viking violence did not exist, that the men who raided and killed and were wounded and watched their companions die somehow experienced none of the emotional and mental consequences that such experiences produce in human beings everywhere. The silence of the sources is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of what the sources chose not to preserve. Björn Ironside, whatever psychological weight he carried from the expedition, seems to have returned to prominence in Scandinavia. The sources that mention him after Eitanskigswan are thin and often contradictory, but they suggest that he remained a figure of significance, involved in the politics and conflicts of the late 9th century. Some traditions make him king of Sweden, of the region around Uppsala specifically, which would become the core of the medieval Swedish kingdom. Other traditions are vaguer about his later life, suggesting only that he lived to old age and died without violent death, a fate that was by no means guaranteed for men of his generation and profession. The reliability of these later accounts is questionable. By the time the sagas were written down, Björn had become a legendary figure, and legendary figures attract stories that may have no historical foundation. The Swedish kingship attributed to him may be genuine, or it may be a later invention designed to connect the prestigious Ragnarsson lineage to the ruling houses of medieval Scandinavia. We cannot be certain. What we can say is that Björn's reputation survived him, that his name continued to carry weight for generations after his death, that the Mediterranean expedition remained the defining achievement of his life as remembered by posterity. He had other accomplishments, presumably. A man does not become legendary on the basis of a single voyage, however spectacular. But the voyage is what lasted. The voyage is what the sagas chose to preserve and elaborate. The voyage is what we know. Hastein's later career is somewhat better documented, or at least more consistently reported. He appears in Frankish sources as a continuing presence in the Western European raiding scene, a veteran pirate who applied the skills and knowledge acquired in the Mediterranean to the more familiar waters of the North Atlantic and the English Channel. He was involved in the complex politics of the Carolingian succession, sometimes allied with Frankish factions, sometimes opposed to them, always operating in the fluid middle ground between legitimate political actor and pure brigand. The sources suggest that Hastein eventually accepted baptism, a common enough development for Viking leaders who wished to integrate into the Christian political order of Western Europe. Whether this represented genuine conversion, political calculation, or some combination of both, we cannot know. Baptism could open doors that remained closed to pagans, treaty relationships, trading privileges, grants of land, integration into the patronage networks that structured medieval European politics. Many Viking leaders took this step when it suited their interests, and their subsequent behavior suggests that the spiritual transformation was not always as complete as their Christian sponsors might have hoped. Hastein's later life may have included settlement in the Loire region, where Viking communities maintained a presence for decades. He may have died in Francia, absorbed into the hybrid culture that emerged when Scandinavian raiders became Scandinavian settlers. Or he may have returned to the north. The sources are unclear, and multiple men named Hastein appear in the records of the late 9th and early 10th centuries, making it difficult to track any single individual with confidence. What matters is not the details of his later life, but what his career represents. The pattern of Viking adaptation, the movement from pure raiding to more complex forms of engagement with the societies Vikings encountered. The Mediterranean expedition was, for Hastein, one episode in a long career that encompassed multiple modes of interaction with the Christian and Islamic worlds. He was a raider, yes, but he was also a negotiator, a politician, a man who understood that violence was only one tool among many and not always the most effective one. This adaptability was characteristic of the Viking Age as a whole. The popular image of the Viking as a mindless berserker, interested only in destruction, is a caricature that obscures the sophistication and flexibility of Norse engagement with other societies. Vikings traded as readily as they raided. They settled as readily as they plundered. They converted, intermarried, learned languages, adopted customs, integrated themselves into the political and economic systems of the regions they encountered. The Mediterranean expedition demonstrates this flexibility. It was a military venture, certainly, but it was also an intelligence-gathering operation, a market-testing exercise, an experiment in the limits of what was possible. The men who returned brought back not only treasure, but information, not only plunder, but understanding. The failure to return to the Mediterranean in force in subsequent decades was not, in this light, simply a matter of defeat suffered or lessons learned about defensive improvements. It was also a judgment about opportunity costs. The world was large, and the resources available to Viking expeditions were finite. Every ship sent south was a ship not sent to England, or to Francia, or to the river systems of Russia. Every warrior who died in the Mediterranean was a warrior who could not participate in the colonization of Iceland or the conquest of the Danelaw. The Mediterranean was magnificent, but it was also far away. The Byzantine emperors paid well for Scandinavian mercenaries, and the Varangian Guard would eventually become a regular feature of Byzantine military organization. But the route to Constantinople through the Russian rivers was easier than the route through Gibraltar, and the opportunities there were just as lucrative with significantly less risk. The Islamic world remained accessible through trade networks that did not require the massive military investments the expedition had demanded. The logic of strategic prioritization pointed elsewhere. Björn and Hastien had proven that the Mediterranean was reachable. Having proven it, the Scandinavian world largely declined to reach again. The proof was sufficient. The repetition was unnecessary. The Mediterranean became, in Norse geographic consciousness, a known quantity, distant, difficult, not worth the cost, while the closer targets continued to absorb the bulk of Viking attention and resources. The expedition's influence was real but subtle. It shaped mental maps without requiring follow-up expeditions. It established possibilities without exploiting them to exhaustion. It became, in the collective memory of Scandinavian society, a benchmark against which other achievements could be measured, a high watermark of audacity that subsequent generations admired without necessarily trying to exceed. The saga tradition that crystallized around the expedition reflected this status. Björn Ironside became the exemplar of the far-traveling Viking, the man who had seen things no one else had seen, reached places no one else had reached. The story of Luni, the false Rome, the coffin trick, the gates open to a dead man who rose from his bier to slaughter his way to plunder, became one of the great set pieces of Viking legend, told and retold, embellished and elaborated, until the historical reality was almost entirely submerged beneath the mythic overlay. The mythic version served the needs of later generations better than the historical truth would have. The historical truth was complex, morally ambiguous, full of suffering and failure alongside achievement. The mythic version was clean, heroic, satisfying. A tale of audacity rewarded, of clever tricks succeeding, of Viking superiority demonstrated against the ancient civilizations of the South. The mythic version was easier to tell, easier to hear, easier to use as a foundation for identity and pride. And so the Mediterranean expedition passed from history into legend, from the messy particularity of what actually happened to the streamlined perfection of what should have happened if the world worked the way stories suggested it should. The ships that actually sailed, their leaks, their worn lines, their exhausted crews, gave way to imagined ships that gleamed and never faltered. The men who actually died, afraid in pain, far from home, gave way to imagined heroes who died gloriously and were remembered forever. This is what legend does to history. It is not lying, exactly, but it is not truth either. It is the transformation of complex reality into simple narrative, the sacrifice of accuracy for meaning, the trade of what was for what we wish had been. The Mediterranean expedition deserves better than its legends offer. It deserves to be remembered as it actually was, a genuine achievement undertaken by real human beings, with all the courage and cruelty, all the calculation and chaos, all the success and failure that any human endeavor contains. Björn Ironside sailed south. He raided the coasts of 3 continents. He believed he had sacked Rome, though he had not. He came home rich and famous, while half his men did not come home at all. This is what happened. This is what it cost. This is what it meant, or what we can recover of its meaning through the fog of centuries and the distortions of sources that cared about glory more than truth. The expedition ended, but the Viking Age did not. The years following 861 would bring transformations that would dwarf even the Mediterranean voyage in their historical significance. The great heathen army was gathering in the mists of the near future, and with it, the conquest that would make England itself a Scandinavian prize. Björn's brothers were about to step into the spotlight of history, and the story of the Ragnarsons was only beginning to unfold. The wealth from the Mediterranean had been divided. The ships had been hauled up onto beaches for repair or breaking. The dead had been mourned or not mourned according to who they were and who they had left behind. And somewhere in Denmark, in Norway, in the fragmenting political landscape of 9th century Scandinavia, young men were listening to the survivors' stories and wondering what they might accomplish where they might sail, what treasures they might seize if only they were bold enough to reach for them. The world was large and it was full of riches, and the men who had seen the warm sea had proven that nothing was beyond the reach of those willing to pay the price. The price had been paid. The survivors had returned. And now, in the years between 862 and 865, the sons of Ragnar faced a question that their father, if he had existed as the sagas portrayed him, would have recognized immediately. What do you do after you have already accomplished the impossible? For Björn Ironside, the answer was to consolidate. He had proven everything that needed proving: his seamanship, his tactical intelligence, his capacity for sustained command over long distances and extended time. He had made himself wealthy beyond the dreams of most Scandinavian lords. He had secured the loyalty of men who had followed him to the edge of the known world and back again. What remained was to translate these advantages into political power, into territory, into the kind of stable lordship that would outlast a single generation. The sources suggest, though they do not confirm, that Björn spent much of the 860s establishing himself in what would later be called Sweden, in the region around Lake Mälaren, where the trading center of Birka flourished and where political authority was fragmenting in ways that created opportunities for a man with warriors at his back and silver in his chests. The Uppsala kings, if Uppsala kingship meant anything stable in this period, which is doubtful, may have regarded him as a rival or an ally, or simply as a force to be accommodated. The details are lost to us, buried beneath later legendary material that transformed Björn into a founding king of a dynasty that probably never existed in the form the legends claim. What matters for our purposes is simpler. Björn survived. He came home from the Mediterranean and lived for years afterward, perhaps decades, dying in circumstances the sources contradict. Some say in bed, others in battle. None with the specificity that would allow confident reconstruction. He fathered sons whose names survived into the historical record, though their accomplishments, if any, have not. He became, in the peculiar economy of Viking fame, more legend than man long before his actual death, his real achievements submerged beneath stories that served his descendants' political needs better than truth would have. But while Björn was consolidating, his brothers were planning something different. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 did not spring into existence from nothing. It represented years of preparation, the accumulation of men and ships and supplies and intelligence that could not have happened overnight. Somewhere in the early 860s, while Björn was perhaps sailing home from the Mediterranean, while the Byzantine Empire was dealing with its own crises, while the Frankish kingdoms continued their disintegration, someone was organizing the largest coordinated Scandinavian military operation ever attempted against the British Isles. The sources name Ivar and his brothers as the leaders of this army. They do not name Björn. This absence is significant. It suggests either that Björn chose not to participate, having had enough of massive expeditions perhaps, or having different political priorities, or that the army's organization happened during or immediately after the Mediterranean voyage, when Björn was simply unavailable. Or it may suggest that the later saga traditions, which group all the brothers together as a unified force, misrepresent a more complex reality in which different sons of Ragnar operated independently, pursuing different strategies in different parts of the world. What seems most likely is that the Mediterranean expedition and the great heathen army represented two parallel but distinct approaches to the problem that defined the late Viking Age: how to convert military capability into permanent gain, how to transform raiding into settlement, how to use the temporary advantage of mobile naval power to secure lasting territorial control. Björn tried the southern route: distant waters, wealthy targets, the accumulation of portable wealth that could be brought home and converted into local power. The army that invaded England tried the western route: closer targets, sustained presence, the direct conquest of territory that would become a new Scandinavian homeland. Both approaches worked in different ways and with different time horizons. Björn's wealth enabled his consolidation in Scandinavia. The great heathen army's conquests created the Danelaw, the vast swath of eastern and northern England that would remain under Scandinavian control for generations. The Viking Age was large enough to contain both strategies, to reward both approaches, to prove that there were multiple paths to the transformation of Scandinavian society, from the peripheral and relatively impoverished communities of the early centuries to the powerful and expansive kingdoms of the high medieval period. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The great heathen army lies in the future of our narrative, a future we will examine in detail. For now, we must stay with what Björn accomplished, what it cost, and what it tells us about the world in which it happened. The Mediterranean expedition of 859-862 was, in one sense, a dead end. The Vikings never returned in force. There would be isolated raids, occasional Scandinavian ships glimpsed in southern waters over the following centuries, but nothing remotely comparable to Björn's fleet would ever sail through Gibraltar again. The Mediterranean remained a Scandinavian frontier that was probed once and then largely abandoned, a road that led somewhere spectacular but proved too costly to travel regularly. This requires explanation. If the expedition was as successful as the sources suggest, if Björn brought back substantial wealth, if the strategic intelligence gathered was valuable, if the route was now proven navigable, why didn't others follow? Why did the Vikings, who followed up successful raids on England and Francia and Ireland with decades of sustained pressure, treat the Mediterranean as a one-time achievement rather than an opening for further exploitation? Several factors combined to make the Mediterranean a dead end rather than a beginning. The first was distance. We have discussed this, but it bears repeating in the context of what came after. The round trip to the Mediterranean consumed roughly 3 years. 3 years during which the crews were unavailable for other enterprises, 3 years during which political situations at home could shift dramatically, 3 years during which investments of ships and men and supplies yielded no return. The English Channel, by contrast, could be crossed in a day under favorable conditions. The coast of Francia was rarely more than a week's sailing from Scandinavian home waters. Ireland was close enough that seasonal raiding patterns had developed, with men crossing west in spring and returning east in autumn. The Mediterranean required a fundamentally different kind of commitment, and for most Viking leaders most of the time, the closer targets offered better returns on investment. The second factor was the improvement of Iberian defenses. The Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba had been caught relatively unprepared by Björn's fleet, but they learned from the experience. In the decades following the expedition, Cordoba invested heavily in naval forces and coastal fortifications. The Strait of Gibraltar became a monitored choke point rather than an unguarded passage. Later Viking expeditions, there would be a few, encountered organized resistance that had simply not existed in 859. The window of vulnerability through which Björn sailed had begun to close even as he was sailing through it. The third factor was the attractiveness of closer alternatives. The 860s and 870s saw the great Viking expansion into England and the intensification of pressure on Francia, developments that absorbed Scandinavian military capacity at levels that left little surplus for distant adventures. Why sail for 3 years to reach uncertain targets in the Mediterranean when the kingdoms of Britain were there for the taking, rich and relatively close, and defended by militaries that the Vikings had proven they could defeat? The great heathen army offered everything the Mediterranean had offered: wealth, glory, the possibility of permanent settlement at a fraction of the distance and risk. The fourth factor, less tangible but no less real, was the nature of the knowledge Björn brought back. The Mediterranean expedition had proven that Vikings could reach the warm sea, could survive there, could plunder and return. But it had also revealed the costs, the losses at Nakur, the disaster at the Rhone, the attrition of men and ships over 3 years of continuous operation far from repair facilities and recruitment grounds. The survivors carried not just wealth, but wisdom, and the wisdom said that easier money was available elsewhere. The Mediterranean was possible, but possible and advisable are different things. And so, the Mediterranean expedition became what it was: a singular achievement, unrepeated and unrepeatable, a high watermark that proved the outer limits of Viking reach without establishing a pattern of sustained activity. Björn Ironside had done something no one had done before, and few would attempt after. He had expanded the map of Viking operations to include the entire western Mediterranean basin. And then the Vikings, collectively and sensibly, had decided that the map was interesting, but the actual territory was not worth the cost of continuous exploitation. This is not failure. It is the rational assessment of options by people who, whatever else they were, understood the economics of maritime predation with intimate clarity. The Mediterranean was a trophy, not a resource. It could be reached, raided, and left. It could not be regularly exploited the way England and Francia and Ireland were exploited. And the Viking Age was, underneath all its glory and violence and transformation, fundamentally an economic phenomenon, the mobilization of Scandinavian military capacity in pursuit of wealth extraction from more prosperous neighbors. When the economics didn't work, even spectacular achievements were not repeated. But the achievement remained, and its effects propagated in ways that transcended the simple question of whether Vikings would return to Italian waters. Consider the impact on Scandinavian self-understanding. Before 859, the Vikings knew they could raid Western Europe. They knew they could fight Christian armies and win. They knew they could extract tribute from kings and sack monasteries that had seemed impregnable. But the Mediterranean expedition proved something different and more profound, that Scandinavian seamanship could operate at intercontinental scale, that Vikings could project power across the entire known world, that the constraints of geography that had confined their ancestors to northern waters no longer applied. This was psychologically transformative. The men who survived the expedition carried stories that reshaped what younger men believed was possible. The wealth they brought back was visible proof that the wider world could be reached and plundered. The knowledge they possessed of currents and coasts, of the lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules, of the strange peoples and unfamiliar landscapes of Africa and Italy, made the world larger and more accessible in the minds of everyone who heard their accounts. The great heathen army was not caused by the Mediterranean expedition, but it operated in a mental landscape that the expedition had helped to shape. The men who sailed for England in 865 knew, because the survivors of Björn's fleet had taught them, that Scandinavian warriors could go anywhere and survive, that distance was not an absolute barrier, that audacity at scale could produce returns beyond what cautious calculation suggested. The expedition had pushed outward the boundaries of the imaginable, and in doing so, it had made other audacious ventures seem less impossible. Consider also the impact on the targets. The Christian kingdoms of Western Europe had spent decades dealing with Viking raids. They had developed imperfectly and with varying success strategies for response, tribute payments, fortifications, local naval forces, the buying of time that sometimes seemed like the buying of peace. But the Mediterranean expedition revealed that nowhere was safe, that even the southern coasts of the old Roman world could burn under Scandinavian torches. This was not a lesson that the local powers appreciated learning. The Italians in particular were shocked. The Mediterranean had seemed protected, too far, too difficult, too well defended by the Muslim powers who controlled the strait and by the Byzantine fleets that patrolled the eastern waters. The fact that Scandinavian ships had penetrated these defenses, had sailed past Cordoba's coast and through Umayyad-controlled waters, had raided Italy itself. This was something new and alarming. The chroniclers who recorded the expedition did so with palpable anxiety, as evidence that the world was becoming more dangerous in ways that the comfortable assumptions of Mediterranean civilization had not prepared them to expect. The warming of diplomatic contacts between Italian states and the broader European community against the Viking threat can be traced in part to the shock of Björn's appearance. Suddenly, the Viking problem was everyone's problem. Suddenly, the distant troubles of England and Francia were relevant to Roman concerns. Suddenly, the need for coordinated Christian response seemed more urgent than it had when the pagan menace was confined to northern waters. This was not the expedition's intention. Björn and his men had no interest in European diplomatic realignment. They wanted silver and slaves and whatever portable wealth they could extract from the places they raided. But historical consequences rarely align with historical intentions. The expedition's effects rippled outward from the immediate violence, changing perceptions and reshaping possibilities across the entire span of Mediterranean civilization. And then there was the effect on the Islamic world. The Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba was, in 859, one of the most sophisticated states in the Western world, wealthier than the Frankish kingdoms, more administratively developed than the fractured Italian city-states, possessed of naval and military capabilities that the Christian powers of the north could not match. When Björn's fleet appeared, it encountered a civilization that was its match in many respects, and its superior in some. The Vikings learned things in Iberian waters that they could not have learned elsewhere. They learned that the Mediterranean was not simply a larger version of the North Sea, that its political landscape included powers capable of organized, effective resistance. They learned that Muslim naval forces, when properly deployed, could inflict serious damage on even a large Viking fleet. They learned, at Nakur, and perhaps at other engagements the sources do not record, that the Islamic world would not simply collapse before Scandinavian arms the way some Christian targets had collapsed. This was useful information, even if it was acquired painfully. It adjusted Viking expectations about what could and could not be achieved in southern waters. It contributed to the eventual decision not to pursue Mediterranean operations further, a decision that, as we have seen, was rational given the alternatives available. The Islamic powers of the Mediterranean did not defeat Björn's expedition in any definitive sense, but they demonstrated their capacity for effective defense, and this demonstration shaped the calculations of future raiders. From the Islamic perspective, the expedition was a minor episode in a much larger story. Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, faced threats from many directions, from the Christian kingdoms of the north, from internal religious and political dissent, from the complications of maintaining authority across a diverse and fractious population. The Viking raiders were a problem, but they were one problem among many, and they were dealt with using the same combination of military force and diplomatic flexibility that the emirate applied to other challenges. The sources suggest that Cordoba improved its coastal defenses after the expedition. More watchtowers, more naval patrols, more attention to the strait that had proven so permeable. These improvements were incremental rather than revolutionary, adjustments to an existing system rather than wholesale reconstruction. The Vikings were dangerous, but they were not an existential threat, not in the way that the Christian Reconquista would eventually prove to be. They were raiders, not conquerors. They came and they went and they did not stay. This made them manageable in ways that other threats were not. But the memory of the expedition persisted. Islamic chroniclers recorded it with varying degrees of accuracy and elaboration. The figure of the Majus, the fire worshippers as the Muslims called the Vikings, became a recurring feature of Iberian historical memory, a reminder that the sea could bring danger from unexpected directions. The Mediterranean would see other northern raiders in the centuries to come, Norman adventurers, crusader fleets, eventually the merchant warriors of the Italian city-states who would transform the region's economy. The Vikings were the first, the proof of concept that the northern seas and the warm sea were connected in ways that could be exploited by those willing to make the attempt. The year turned. The seasons cycled, and somewhere in the chaos of mid-9th century Scandinavia, the brothers of Björn Ironside were preparing a venture that would make even the Mediterranean expedition seem like a preliminary exercise. They were going to take a kingdom. The kingdom they were going to take was England. But before we turn to that story, before we follow Ivar the Boneless and his brothers across the gray waters to the fractured island that would become the crucible of Viking ambition, we must reckon with what Björn Ironside brought home from the Mediterranean. Not the plunder, though there was plunder. Not the slaves, though there were slaves. What he brought home was knowledge, and knowledge in the 9th century was a weapon that did not rust. The returning fleet reached the Strait of Gibraltar sometime in 861, 2 years after it had first entered Mediterranean waters. The precise timing is lost, but the season was almost certainly spring or early summer, the sailing months, when the winds favored northward passage and the sea surrendered some of its winter hostility. Of the 62 ships that had originally departed Scandinavia, the sources suggest that perhaps 40 made the return journey. Some had been lost to storms, others to combat, still others to the simple attrition of prolonged maritime campaigning. Hulls that weakened, crews that dwindled, vessels that were abandoned or cannibalized for repairs. The losses were significant, but not catastrophic. A two-thirds survival rate for an expedition of this duration and ambition was, by the standards of the age, reasonably good. The ships that emerged from the strait were different from the ships that had entered it. They had been repaired with Mediterranean timber, caulked with Mediterranean pitch, their sails patched and their rigging replaced in a dozen different ports. The men who sailed them had been transformed as well, marked by southern sun and southern diseases, carrying wounds acquired in engagements from Algeciras to Luna, their memories populated with images that no Scandinavian had ever seen before. They had walked on African soil. They had touched the walls of cities founded by Rome and Carthage. They had encountered civilizations that measured their histories in millennia rather than generations. They were coming home as something new, men who had seen the world beyond the world. The voyage north was itself an education. The Atlantic coast of Iberia remained hostile, Asturian patrols, Galician fishing communities that had learned to flee at the sight of dragon-prowed ships, a landscape that offered little encouragement to raiders who had already taken what could be taken. The fleet moved quickly, pausing only when necessary for water and provisions, making for the relative safety of Frankish waters where the political chaos of the post-Carolingian world offered opportunities that the Iberian coast did not. They reached the mouth of the Loire sometime in the summer of 861. The river was familiar territory. Vikings had been raiding its banks since the 840s, had established semi-permanent bases on its islands, had extorted payments from the monasteries and towns that clustered along its fertile reaches. Here was home in a way that the Mediterranean had never been: cold water, gray skies, the smell of northern forests drifting down from the interior. Here were kinsmen and trading partners, information networks that connected the scattered settlements of the Scandinavian diaspora, news of what had happened in the world while Björn and his men were chasing ghosts in Italian waters. The news was significant. In the 2 years of their absence, the political landscape of the North Sea world had shifted. Charles the Bald still clung to power in West Francia, but his authority remained contested, his kingdom hemorrhaging at its edges to Viking pressure and internal rebellion. The Danes of the Seine had continued their operations, extracting tribute from Paris and its environs, establishing patterns of seasonal raiding that were beginning to look like something more permanent. In England, the small kingdoms continued their quarreling existence. Wessex and Mercia and East Anglia and Northumbria, locked in their eternal competitions, apparently unaware that they were about to face a challenge that would render their petty conflicts irrelevant. And in Scandinavia itself, the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok were gathering their strength. The Mediterranean expedition had been a test. It had been a proof of capability, a demonstration that Viking fleets could operate at distances and durations previously unimagined. It had shown that the wealth of the South was accessible to those with sufficient will and sufficient ships. But it had also revealed the limits of that model, the logistical challenges, the military resistance, the sheer difficulty of sustaining operations so far from home. Björn and Hastein had learned these lessons through direct experience, had paid for them in ships and men and years of their lives. Now they had to decide what to do with what they had learned. For Hastein, the answer was straightforward. He returned to the pattern he knew, raiding in Frankish waters, exploiting the weaknesses of the Carolingian system, accumulating wealth through the tried methods of extortion and plunder. The sources show him active on the Loire in the years following the Mediterranean expedition, a figure of persistent menace to the monasteries and trading posts of the region. He had survived the southern venture. He would continue surviving in the north. There was no need to seek glory when gold was available closer to hand. For Björn, the answer was more complex. He disappears from the historical record after 862, his fate one of the enduring mysteries of the Viking Age. The Scandinavian sagas written centuries later would create elaborate legends around his later life, claiming that he returned to Sweden, that he became king, that he died peacefully in his bed after a lifetime of conquest. But the contemporary sources simply stopped mentioning him. as though he had sailed beyond the edge of the known world and never returned. Perhaps he did return to Sweden. Perhaps he died of wounds acquired in the Mediterranean, or of the diseases that haunted Viking camps, or of simple old age in a culture where 40 years was a respectable span. Perhaps he lived out his days in some Frankish or Scandinavian settlement, his tales of Italian marble and African shores growing more elaborate with each telling, his glory a thing of memory rather than continuing action. We do not know. The sources are silent, and silence in medieval sources can mean many things: death, obscurity, the simple accident of documentation. What remains is the expedition itself, frozen in the historical record like a fly in amber, its consequences rippling outward long after its protagonist had vanished from view. Those consequences require careful examination. The Mediterranean expedition was not, in any conventional sense, a success. The expedition did not establish permanent Viking settlements in the south. It did not fundamentally alter the political balance of Mediterranean power. It did not open new trade routes or create lasting alliances between Scandinavian and Mediterranean peoples. By the metrics that mattered to 9th century observers, land acquired, kingdoms subdued, tribute secured in perpetuity, the venture achieved little. Björn and Hastein returned with plunder, but plunder was ephemeral. They returned with captives, but captives were sold and scattered. They returned with stories, but stories did not build dynasties. And yet, the expedition demonstrated something that had not been demonstrated before, that the entire western Mediterranean was accessible to seaborne raiders from the north. This was new information, and new information changed calculations. Before 859, the Mediterranean existed in the Scandinavian imagination as a distant abstraction, the Greek Sea, the warm water at the bottom of the world, a place known only through rumors and traded goods. After 861, it was concrete. Real men had sailed there, had seen the minarets of Algeciras and the harbors of the Balearics, and the crumbling grandeur of Italian amphitheaters. Real men had returned to tell of it. The South was no longer legendary. It was achievable. This mattered because it expanded the mental map of what was possible. The Vikings who followed Björn and Hastein into Mediterranean waters, and there would be followers, scattered raids and expeditions throughout the following decades, knew that the venture could be attempted. They knew the rough shape of the route, the approximate distances, the nature of the resistance they would encounter. They had a template. And templates, even templates of limited success, are more useful than blank ignorance. The expedition also mattered because it fed into a larger pattern of Scandinavian expansion that was reshaping Europe during precisely these decades. Consider the timeline. Björn's fleet enters the Mediterranean in 859. In 860, a Swedish fleet from the Rus settlements attacks Constantinople itself, a separate venture, organized by different people, but operating on similar principles of long-range opportunism. In 865, the great heathen army lands in England, beginning the conquest that would eventually give the Danes control of half the island. In 866, Viking forces capture York, ending the independence of Northumbria. In 870, the East Anglian king Edmund is martyred, his kingdom absorbed into the expanding Danish sphere. These events were connected, not by direct coordination, but by a shared culture of maritime aggression that was reaching its maximum extent during these years. The sons of Ragnar, Björn in the Mediterranean, Ivar and his brothers in England, were the leading edge of a movement that was transforming the political geography of Europe. The Mediterranean expedition was part of this larger pattern, a probe into waters that were ultimately determined to be less profitable than the opportunities available closer to home. The decision to concentrate on England rather than Italy was, in essence, a strategic reallocation of Scandinavian military resources toward targets that offered better returns. But the possibility remained. Mediterranean raiding would continue, sporadically, for another century. Viking fleets would appear in Spanish waters throughout the late 9th and early 10th centuries, would reach as far as Morocco and the Tunisian coast, would maintain the pressure that kept Umayyad and Fatimid naval forces perpetually alert. None of these later expeditions matched the scale or duration of Björn's venture. None of them had the same transformative effect on Scandinavian consciousness, but they all operated within the space that the original expedition had opened, a space where the Mediterranean was no longer impossibly remote, but merely very far away. The ripples extended beyond rating. The knowledge that Vikings had acquired about Mediterranean geography, navigation, and trade would filter into the broader Scandinavian understanding of the world. Sailors who had navigated the strait would know things about currents and winds and coastal landmarks that could be passed to other sailors. Merchants who had seen Mediterranean goods at their source would have better information about their value and their origins. Even the failures of the expedition, the realization that Luna was not Rome, the discovery that Muslim naval forces could mount effective resistance, added to the collective Scandinavian understanding of the world beyond their immediate horizons. This expansion of knowledge was part of an even larger transformation. The 9th century was the moment when Scandinavians began to compile the geographic and nautical information that would eventually take them to Greenland, to Vinland, to the New World itself. The skills that Björn's crews developed in Mediterranean waters, the ability to navigate without sight of land, to read unfamiliar stars, to survive in climates radically different from their own, were the same skills that would later carry Leif Erikson to North American shores. The Mediterranean expedition was a training exercise for even more ambitious ventures to come. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the expedition was psychological rather than material. Björn Ironside returned from the Mediterranean as a legend, the man who had sailed beyond the edge of the known world, who had sacked cities in Italy believing them to be Rome, who had extracted prisoners from African shores. This man became a figure of story and song, his exploits magnified with each retelling until the historical Björn was nearly invisible beneath the legendary one. The sagas that would be written centuries later would make him a king and a conqueror, would credit him with adventures far beyond anything the contemporary sources record. He became, in the Scandinavian imagination, a symbol of what was possible when ambition was allied with seamanship. This legendary status fed back into Viking culture in subtle but important ways. The young warriors of the following generation, the men who would sail with the great heathen army, who would establish kingdoms in Ireland and northern France, who would push into the rivers of Eastern Europe, grew up with stories of Björn's Mediterranean venture. These stories told them that there were no waters too distant, no targets too ambitious, no limits to what Scandinavian arms could achieve. The expedition became a touchstone, a reference point for measuring other accomplishments. When later raiders contemplated their own ventures, they could ask, will this match what Björn did in the Southern Sea? The Mediterranean expedition also had effects that ran in the opposite direction, effects that shaped how the peoples of the Mediterranean remembered and understood the northern threat. For the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian coast, the venture was a sharp reminder of their vulnerability. The ease with which Björn's fleet had passed through the Strait of Gibraltar, had raided virtually at will along shores that were nominally protected, had extracted plunder and prisoners with apparent impunity. This demonstrated the inadequacy of existing defensive arrangements. The Asturian and Galician responses to Viking raiding intensified in the years following the expedition. Coastal fortifications were strengthened. Warning systems were improved. Naval patrols became more systematic. The Vikings had demonstrated that the Atlantic coast was a frontier, a border zone that required active defense. For the Italian city-states, the lesson was different but equally significant. The sack of Luna was not the last time Viking raiders would threaten Italian shores. There would be further attacks, further alarms, further demands for ransom and tribute. But the expedition had shown that Italy was not simply a destination for peaceful traders carrying northern amber and furs. It was a target, a place where armed ships might appear without warning and armed men might storm the walls. The Italian cities that would eventually develop the most sophisticated maritime defenses in the Mediterranean, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, were already beginning to invest in those defenses during the decades following Björn's expedition. The Viking threat was one among many factors driving that investment, but it was a real factor, a reminder that the sea was a highway that ran in both directions. For Byzantium, the eastern Mediterranean power that Björn's expedition never reached but surely contemplated, the venture was information about the changing character of northern peoples. The Byzantines had long dealt with Scandinavians. The Varangians of the Rus trade routes were already familiar figures in Constantinople, already being recruited into the imperial bodyguard, already being integrated into the complex diplomatic and commercial systems of the eastern Mediterranean. But Björn's expedition demonstrated that Scandinavians were also capable of purely aggressive ventures, of military expeditions that sought plunder rather than trade. This complicated Byzantine calculations about how to manage the northern relationship. The Varangians could be useful allies and trading partners, but they were also potential threats, a lesson that the attack on Constantinople in 860, occurring almost simultaneously with Björn's Mediterranean voyage, reinforced with brutal clarity. All of these effects, the expanded Scandinavian mental map, the intensified Mediterranean defenses, the legendary status of the expedition in Norse culture, combined to create something larger than any individual consequence. The Mediterranean expedition marked a moment of contact between civilizational spheres that had previously interacted only through the slow medium of trade. For a brief period, Scandinavian warriors moved through spaces that had been shaped by Rome and Carthage, by Islam and Byzantium, by the layered histories of peoples who had been building cities while the ancestors of the Vikings were still dwelling in scattered agricultural settlements along Scandinavian fjords. This contact did not transform either sphere in fundamental ways. The Vikings did not become Mediterraneans, did not adopt the religions or political systems or cultural practices of the South. The Mediterranean peoples did not suddenly become Northerners, did not abandon their ancient ways for the practices of Scandinavian society. The expedition was a collision, not a fusion, two worlds meeting briefly and violently before separating again, each carrying fragments of the other back to their respective homelands. But collisions leave marks. They change trajectories. They create memories that shape future encounters. The Mediterranean expedition was one such collision, and its marks were visible for generations afterward. The ships of Björn's returning fleet would have been hauled onto the beaches of their home fjords sometime in late 861 or early 862. The men who stepped off those ships would have been greeted by families who had not seen them for 3 years, by communities that had perhaps given them up for dead, by a world that had continued its turning while they were away chasing myths in warm waters. They would have told their stories, of Algeciras burning, of African markets, of the walls of Luna and the strange beauty of Italian light. They would have displayed their plunder, distributed their captives, settled their accounts with the dead, and then they would have returned to the ongoing business of being Vikings. The Mediterranean was behind them. England lay ahead. The great wheels of the 9th century were still turning, still carrying the sons of Ragnar toward their various fates, Björn into obscurity, Ivar into legend, the rest into the bloody business of conquest that would reshape the map of northern Europe. The warm sea had been a proving ground. The cold sea would be a battlefield. The return was not triumphant. That is the first thing to understand about what happened when Björn's diminished fleet scraped onto the beaches of home. Triumph requires an audience prepared to receive it, a society organized around the celebration of distant victories, a cultural infrastructure for processing the meaning of what has been accomplished. The Scandinavian world of 862 possessed none of these things in the form that later ages would develop. There were no chroniclers waiting to interview the returning warriors, no poets commissioned to compose immediate commemorations, no official ceremonies of welcome sanctioned by centralized authority. There were only families, neighbors, local chieftains, people who had their own concerns, their own seasons to manage, their own dead to mourn, and living to feed. The Mediterranean expedition, whatever its ultimate historical significance, arrived home to a society that had no particular framework for understanding it. The plunder would have helped. Silver speaks a universal language, and the holds of those 20 surviving ships surely contained enough precious metal to attract attention. The textiles, too, silk and fine linen that could be displayed, traded, gifted to important allies. The captives who had survived the voyage represented wealth on two legs, labor power that could be sold or enslaved or ransomed, depending on their origins and the opportunities that presented themselves. A man who returned from 3 years of Mediterranean raiding with visible wealth was a man whose stories would be listened to. A man who returned empty-handed was simply a fool who had wasted 3 years chasing nothing. But wealth alone does not explain the expedition's eventual legendary status in Norse culture. Many raids produced wealth. Many expeditions returned with silver and silk and slaves. What made the Mediterranean venture different was its scope, its strangeness, its sheer improbability. The warriors who had sailed through the Pillars of Hercules had done something that most of their neighbors could not even imagine. They had seen lands that existed, for the majority of Scandinavians, only in vague rumors and half-understood traders' tales. They had fought battles against peoples whose very names sounded exotic and distant. They had navigated waters that the entire accumulated wisdom of their maritime culture had no maps for. This strangeness was the expedition's true cargo, more valuable in the long run than any amount of silver. The returning warriors carried in their memories an expanded version of the world, a mental geography that stretched from the familiar fjords of their birth to the sun-baked coasts of Africa and the marble cities of Italy. They carried stories that their grandchildren would repeat, details that would be elaborated and transformed and mythologized across generations until the original experience became something larger than any mere raid, became a saga, a proof of what Scandinavian warriors were capable of, a foundation for later ambitions and later expeditions. Björn himself disappears into this process of mythologization. The historical sources become fragmentary and contradictory regarding his fate. Some traditions suggest he returned to rule in Sweden, establishing a dynasty that would persist for generations. Other traditions are silent about him entirely, as if the Mediterranean expedition was the last significant event of his life. The sagas that survive give him various endings: death in battle, peaceful old age, obscure fates in obscure places. The truth is that we do not know what became of Björn Ironside after his fleet returned from the warm sea. This not knowing is itself historically significant. It reminds us that the early medieval period was not evenly documented, that fame in one context did not guarantee preservation in another. Björn's expedition was remembered by Arab chroniclers, by Frankish annalists, by Italian historians, by the peoples who had suffered his raids and who had reason to record them. But Scandinavian society in the 9th century did not yet possess the written infrastructure to preserve detailed biographical information about its own leaders. The sagas that would eventually be written down were centuries in the future, and by the time they were composed, the actual life of Björn Ironside had been transformed into something else entirely. A character in a mythological family drama, a son of the legendary Ragnar, a figure whose historical reality had been subsumed into narrative convention. What we can say is that the Mediterranean expedition did not immediately change Björn's life in the ways that dramatic narrative might suggest. He did not become king of all Scandinavia on the strength of his southern victories. He did not found a Mediterranean empire or establish lasting connections with the civilizations he had raided. He returned to a world that was about to be consumed by other concerns: the conquest of England, the civil wars of the Frankish Empire, the slow consolidation of power that would eventually produce the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms. The Mediterranean venture, for all its spectacular drama, was a side chapter in a larger story that was still being written. The conquest of England, in particular, would dominate the next decade of Viking activity. The great heathen army that landed in East Anglia in 865 represented a new phase in Scandinavian expansion, not raids for plunder, but campaigns for land, not brief violent incursions, but sustained military operations aimed at permanent settlement. This was the work of Ivar and his brothers, a continuation of the Ragnarsson project by other means. Björn may have participated in some of these campaigns, the sources are unclear, but his Mediterranean expertise was not particularly relevant to the English theater. The skills required to navigate unfamiliar waters and raid coastal cities were not the same skills required to conquer and hold agricultural territories against organized resistance. What the Mediterranean expedition had proven was possibility. It had demonstrated that the Scandinavian maritime system was capable of operating at extreme range, that ships built for the cold waters of the north could survive and fight in the warm waters of the south. It had shown that the Vikings were not merely a local phenomenon, a threat to the peoples of the North Sea and the Baltic, but a force capable of projecting power across continental distances. This proof of possibility would matter for centuries afterward, inspiring later expeditions that built on Björn's achievement even as they forgot his name. The Varangian routes to Constantinople, which would become so important in the 10th and 11th centuries, were not a direct consequence of the Mediterranean expedition. Those routes developed through the river systems of Russia, a completely different geographical approach to the same ultimate destination. But the success of the Varangians in integrating themselves into Byzantine society, as traders, as mercenaries, as members of the imperial guard, was made possible in part by the demonstration that Scandinavians could operate effectively in Mediterranean contexts. Björn's expedition had shown that northern warriors were not helpless outside their native waters, that they possessed the adaptability and tactical intelligence to succeed in unfamiliar environments. This reputation preceded the Varangians, creating opportunities that might not have existed if the only examples of Scandinavian-Mediterranean contact had been failures and disasters. The 10th century, in particular, saw intensified Scandinavian interest in the Mediterranean world. Norman adventurers, the descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France, began filtering southward into Italy, drawn by the same opportunities for military employment and political advancement that had always attracted armed men to contested regions. These Normans would eventually conquer Sicily and southern Italy, establishing kingdoms that fused Scandinavian, French, Italian, Byzantine, and Arab influences into something entirely new. This later Norman achievement cannot be attributed directly to Björn's expedition, separated as it was by more than a century and several intermediary developments. But the expedition had contributed to a Scandinavian imagination of the Mediterranean as a space where northern warriors could succeed, a mental map that made later southern ventures seem more plausible, more worth attempting. The Arab world, too, was changed by the Viking presence, though in ways that are difficult to trace precisely. The intensification of coastal defenses along the Moroccan and Andalusian coasts continued long after Björn's fleet had departed. The vocabulary of threat expanded to include the Magus, the fire worshippers from the north. Diplomatic considerations had to account for the possibility of Viking raids in ways they had not before. The Mediterranean, which Arab traders and sailors had navigated with relative security for generations, became a slightly more dangerous space, a sea where unexpected enemies might appear. This was a marginal effect, hardly comparable to the existential threats that Arab powers faced from other directions. But margins matter. They accumulate. They shape the texture of daily life in ways that grand narratives often overlook. For the peoples who had suffered Björn's attacks directly, the citizens of Algeciras, the defenders of Luna, the coastal populations who had seen the dragon-proud ships appearing on their horizons, the expedition was not a matter of geopolitical significance or cultural memory. It was simply a catastrophe, one of many that the 9th century delivered to Mediterranean communities. The dead were mourned, the destroyed was rebuilt, the captives were remembered by families who would never see them again. The experience of being raided does not produce philosophical reflections on the meaning of civilizational contact. It produces grief and fear and the slow work of recovery. We cannot access these experiences through the sources that survive. The Arab chroniclers who wrote about the expedition were not interviewing traumatized villagers. The later Italian historians, who mentioned the sack of Luna, were interested in dramatic narrative, not in the mundane suffering of ordinary people. The voice of the Mediterranean raid victim is as absent from the historical record as the voice of the Scandinavian farmer who stayed home, as absent as the voice of the enslaved person who was sold in an African market, as absent as the voice of the crew member who died of disease or violence during the long voyage and was buried in foreign soil. These silences are not gaps that can be filled by imagination or speculation. They are permanent losses, parts of the human past that will never be recovered. What we can say is that the 9th century Mediterranean was a world of extensive violence, a space where raids and conquests and religious conflicts were ordinary features of existence. The Viking expedition was shocking, not because violence was unusual, but because this particular violence came from an unexpected direction. The Mediterranean peoples were accustomed to threats from each other, Christian against Muslim, Byzantine against Arab, the fragmented political entities of Italy, perpetually at war with their neighbors. They were not accustomed to threats from the far north, from peoples who had no obvious stake in the religious and political conflicts that shaped Mediterranean life. This unexpectedness gave the Viking raids their particular character of nightmare, the sense that danger could come from anywhere, that no coast was truly safe. The expedition's fame, its survival in memory across the centuries, was partly a function of this unexpectedness. Stories persist when they confound expectations, when they present the world as stranger and more various than quotidian experience suggests. A fleet of northern ships sailing through the Strait of Gibraltar, raiding the coasts of Africa, attacking Italian cities. This was a story worth telling precisely because it seemed almost impossible, a collision of worlds that should have remained separate. The narrative appealed to audiences who wanted to believe that the boundaries of the ordinary could be transgressed, that human daring and skill could overcome any geographical or cultural distance. But the story also persisted because it was true. The sources, for all their limitations and biases and gaps, agree on the basic facts of the expedition. Something remarkable happened in 859-861. A fleet really did sail from Scandinavia through the Mediterranean and back again. Raids really were conducted against multiple targets across enormous distances. Warriors really did return with plunder and stories of strange lands. The legendary status of the expedition is not merely a myth projected onto a vague historical foundation. It is a myth that grew from real events, real experiences, real achievements that justified the awe with which later generations regarded them. This matters because it reminds us that the past was not less dramatic than the stories tell us. If anything, the reality was more complex, more difficult, more demanding than any saga could convey. Sailing a longship from Scandinavia to Italy required not just courage, but competence, navigational skill, logistical planning, diplomatic maneuvering, tactical intelligence. The men who accomplished this feat were not merely brave, they were capable. They understood their ships, their crews, their enemies, their environment. They made calculations and took risks and adjusted to circumstances that no one could have anticipated in advance. This is the true heroism of the expedition, not the romantic image of wild berserkers charging into battle, but the sustained professional excellence of men who knew their craft and applied it at the uttermost limit of its potential. The longship itself deserves final consideration, this vessel that made everything possible. The ships that returned to Scandinavia in 862 were not the same ships that had departed 3 years earlier. They had been repaired and patched and modified to address damage and were accumulated across thousands of miles of sailing. They had been adapted in small ways to the conditions of Mediterranean navigation. They carried in their very hulls the evidence of their journey, the scars and modifications that told the story of where they had been. These ships were technological artifacts of the first order, the physical manifestation of centuries of Scandinavian maritime development. Without them, the expedition would have been impossible. With them, the expedition was merely extremely difficult. The men who sailed those ships were also transformed by the journey. They had seen things that their neighbors had never seen. They had eaten food and worn clothing, and spent currency and spoken languages that most Scandinavians would never encounter. They had been tested by circumstances that demanded constant adaptation, constant learning, constant recalculation of what was possible. Some of them had surely grown during the journey, becoming more than they had been when they left. Others had surely been broken by it, traumatized by violence witnessed or inflicted, hollowed out by loss and fear and the accumulated weight of 3 years of warfare. The expedition produced not a uniform type of returning warrior, but a collection of individuals, each carrying their own version of the experience, each processing it through their own psychology and circumstances. The years immediately following the return saw these men dispersed back into the normal structures of Scandinavian society. Some would join the campaigns in England, carrying their Mediterranean experience into entirely different theaters of war. Others would return to farming and fishing and the ordinary occupations that sustained Scandinavian life between military ventures. Still others would die young, as so many warriors died, their Mediterranean service merely a prelude to other battles and other ends. The expedition was not a permanent identity for most of its survivors. It was an episode, however transformative, in lives that continued to unfold according to their own logics. Björn's fate remains the central mystery. The sources allow us to imagine multiple endings for him: glorious death, peaceful decline, obscure disappearance. Perhaps he ruled for decades in Sweden, telling stories of the warm sea to grandchildren who could scarcely believe them. Perhaps he died in some forgotten skirmish a few years after his return, his Mediterranean fame meaning nothing to the spear that killed him. Perhaps he lived into old age and found that his great adventure had become a burden, a standard against which all subsequent experience seemed diminished. We cannot know. The silence of the sources on this point is complete. What we can know is that something endured. The story persisted. Across the centuries of oral tradition, across the eventual writing down of the sagas, across the recovery of Arab and Latin sources by modern historians, the Mediterranean expedition survived as an object of memory and investigation. It survived because it mattered, because it represented something true about human capability, about the range of what organized and determined people can accomplish when they decide to attempt the seemingly impossible. The warm sea still lies beyond the Pillars of Hercules, as it lay when Björn's fleet passed through in 859. The sun still sets over water that has witnessed the passage of countless ships, countless ambitions, countless ventures into the unknown. The coasts that Björn raided have been rebuilt many times over, their 9th century appearance entirely erased by subsequent development. Nothing remains of the expedition in physical form, no preserved ship, no identifiable gravesite, no artifact that can be definitively connected to the Mediterranean voyage. What remains is the story, and the questions the story poses about who we are, and what we might be capable of. A fleet of wooden ships crewed by men from the cold north sailed through waters that no one from their homeland had ever sailed before. They fought battles, took plunder, lost comrades, and returned to tell the tale. The tale became legend. The legend shaped how later generations understood their own possibilities. This is the final cargo that the Mediterranean expedition delivered to history. Not silver, not silk, not slaves, but proof. Proof that the boundaries of the known world were not fixed. Proof that the impossible was merely the not yet attempted. Proof that human beings, organized and determined and willing to endure, could cross any distance, face any enemy, navigate any strange water. The ships have rotted. The warriors have become bone and dust. The glory they sought has become paragraphs in books that most people will never read. But the warm sea remembers nothing, and the cold sea has forgotten them too. Only the story remains, a fire lit 13 centuries ago, still casting light across the dark.